All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a pretty fascinating area, something that's really at the cutting edge of medicine. Computer-aided diagnostics, or, we call it CAD for short.
Yeah, CAD.
These systems are designed to be like a second pair of eyes for medical professionals, to help them sort through tons of data and really try to make the best decisions for patients.
That's right. So think about it this way. A doctor had this incredibly complex job, and CAD systems are kind of like super efficient research assistants. They can sift through mountains of medical information like symptoms, medical history, test results, all that stuff.
Yeah, there's just so much data in medicine these days.
And then they flag any potential issues that the doctor might want to take a closer look at.
Exactly. It's all about using tech to improve healthcare, right? To make things more efficient and hopefully get better outcomes for everyone. But here's where it gets really interesting. You see, a lot of these really powerful CAD systems, they depend on what we call black box machine learning models. And now, these models, they're fantastic at spotting patterns and making predictions. They're really good at it. But the problem is, we don't always fully understand how they arrive at their conclusions.
Yeah, it's like you get this amazing insight from this super smart tool, but it can't really explain to you why it thinks that way.
Right. And especially in medicine, trust is absolutely crucial. A doctor needs to be able to understand the reasoning behind any suggestion a CAD system makes. That's before they can actually use that information to make a decision about a patient's care. And that is where this whole field of explainable AI or XAI comes in.
XAI.
And it's all about opening up these black boxes, so to speak.
That's it. It's about lifting the veil and making those models more transparent, to make it crystal clear to doctors how the AI is making its decisions so they can trust those decisions.
So today's deep dive is going to focus on one specific type of this black box model that's used a lot in CAD systems. It's called AdaBoost.
Right, AdaBoost.
And for this, we're actually going to be drawing from a research paper titled WHIPS, explaining AdaBoost classification with applications in the health sciences. Now it's by Hatwell and his colleagues.
It's a great paper. It really gets into the nitty-gritty of making AdaBoost more understandable, especially in the context of healthcare.
Yeah. So we're going to try to answer a couple of big questions today. First, how does AdaBoost actually work in CAD systems? And second, how can this new method called AdaWhips make those decisions made by AdaBoost more transparent and therefore more trustworthy for doctors like you who are out there on the front lines making these important decisions? So let's start with the basics. Why is the lack of transparency with these black box models like AdaBoost such a big deal in medicine specifically? It's not like recommending a movie on Netflix or something.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It comes down to the fact that medical diagnosis is just inherently complex. Doctors have to consider so many different factors when they're trying to figure out what's going on with a patient. You've got the symptoms the patient's describing, you've got their past medical history, their family history, physical exam findings,
lab results.
Oh, and yeah, tons of lab tests, imaging studies, and all this information, it's constantly growing. Healthcare is just drowning in data these days, which we call big data.
Big data, yeah.
It's massive and complex, and it's only getting bigger.
Yeah.
So CAD systems, powered by machine learning algorithms like AdaBoost, they have this huge potential to analyze this massive amount of data and maybe even see things that humans might miss. We could be talking about earlier disease detection, more accurate diagnoses, and in the end, better outcomes for patients.
Yeah, I see the potential there, absolutely. But, we're right back to the black box problem.
Yeah.
You said that AdaBoost is one of these models, right? So why is this lack of transparency such a problem, especially when we're talking about something as important as people's health?
Well, you see, these sophisticated models, like AdaBoost, they're really good at what they do. They're often incredibly accurate. But they achieve this accuracy through these, complicated mathematical processes and pattern recognition that's just really hard for us humans to understand.
Yeah, it's like you get the answer, but you don't know how the math got there.
Exactly. And for doctors who are trained to understand the reasoning behind a diagnosis, this lack of clarity, it can be a huge barrier to actually trusting what the model's telling them. They need to be able to scrutinize the model's output and understand what factors led to a specific prediction. Yeah. They can't just blindly trust a machine, right?
Right, it's too big a risk.
They have to be able to understand it and justify their decisions, especially when those decisions can have such a huge impact on a patient's life.
This is people's health we're talking about. It's not just a matter of convenience. And the paper even talks about the legal and ethical side of things. There's a growing movement toward a right to explanation, especially when AI is making decisions that can have serious consequences, like in medicine.
That's right.
A simple yes or no from a black box just doesn't cut it anymore.
No, it doesn't. Not in this day and age.
It's interesting. The paper actually points out that AdaBoost is already being used in all sorts of medical applications, even though it is a bit of a black box.
So yeah, it's really versatile. They're using it to help diagnose everything from Alzheimer's to diabetes, hypertension, even various cancers.
Cancers? Wow.
And they're even using it in mental health assessments, even outside of traditional clinical settings. It's pretty impressive.
It really is. But if it's so effective, why is it so hard to understand?
Well, AdaBoost is what we call an ensemble learner. Basically, that means it's not just one big, complex decision-making system. It's actually made up of lots of simpler decision-making units called decision trees. Hundreds or even thousands of them, all working together.
Decision trees? I'm not sure I'm following.
Think of it like a committee. Each decision tree makes a simple decision based on a few factors.
Okay.
And then AdaBoost takes all of those individual decisions from the trees and combines them using a weighted majority vote, like a vote where some votes count more than others.
Okay, so it's not just one brain. It's like a whole bunch of little brains all putting in their 2 cents.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. But all those votes and the way they're weighted, that's what makes it so difficult to figure out why the final decision was made. It's a real mathematical puzzle. And that's exactly what Hatwell and his team are trying to solve with their research. How do we make sense of this black box, especially when it's being used to help make medical decisions?
And their answer is this AdaWHIPS algorithm, right? So can you explain what that is and how it tackles this problem?
Right. So AdaWHIPS, which stands for Adaptive Weighted High Importance Path Snippets.
Catchy.
Well, it's a new algorithm that's specifically designed to open up this black box of multi-class AdaBoost classification. Basically, it goes inside a trained AdaBoost model and tries to extract simple, understandable rules from all those decision trees we talked about.
So it's not trying to build a new model to imitate AdaBoost. It's actually trying to figure out how AdaBoost itself is working.
Exactly. It's like instead of building a new car to try and understand how the old one works, you just open up the hood of the old one and start looking at the engine.
Right. Get your hands dirty. So how does it do that? What are the steps involved?
All right. So the first step is what they call extracting decision paths.
Decision paths.
So let's say you have a patient and you want to understand why AdaBoost made a certain prediction for that patient. AdaWHIPS focuses on the specific path that this patient's data takes as it goes through each of those individual decision trees in the whole AdaBoost ensemble.
Okay, so it's not looking at every single possible decision each tree could make.
Right.
It's only looking at the decisions that were actually made for this particular patient.
Exactly. It's following the trail of breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
And it gets even more specific. It only looks at the trees that agree with the final weighted majority vote of the whole model.
So the trees that were most confident in their prediction.
Exactly. They figure that those trees probably have the most important information about why the final decision was made. It's kind of like if you're trying to understand why a group made a certain decision, you might focus on the people who are the most vocal in their support of that decision.
Yeah, makes sense. So what does one of these decision paths look like?
A decision path is basically a series of yes-no questions or split conditions that are based on the features in the patient's data. For example, one split condition might be, is the patient's blood pressure higher than 140? And depending on the answer, it might go to the next question, like, is the patient over 65? And so on, until it reaches a final prediction for that individual tree.
Like a flow chart.
Yeah, exactly.
And the next step, you said it was redistributing adaptive weights. What does that mean?
Right. So after it figures out the decision paths, AdaWHIPS takes those paths and breaks them down into smaller pieces called path snippets. These are like the individual questions or decisions in those flowcharts.
Okay.
And then it takes the weights that AdaBoost originally gave to each tree. Remember, those were based on how well each tree performed during training. And it redistributes those weights onto these individual path snippets.
So instead of giving importance to the whole tree, it's looking at the importance of each individual question.
Yes, exactly. And it also considers how deep that question is in the tree and how often that same question pops up in other trees. So it's looking for the questions that seem to be the most important across the board. And to do that, it uses a measure called relative entropy. It's basically a way of figuring out how much information each question provides in terms of separating different diagnostic possibilities.
So it's identifying the most informative questions. Then what?
Then AdaWhips uses all of this information to generate a classification rule. It takes the most important questions, the ones that were most helpful in distinguishing between different diagnoses, and it turns them into simple, understandable rules that a doctor can easily read and interpret.
If this, then that kind of thing.
Exactly, if-then rules. And it tries to find the smallest set of conditions that are still very accurate and apply to a lot of patients. One really cool thing they did was introduce this concept of stability into the process.
Stability, what's that all about?
Well, you see, one problem with these explanation methods is that sometimes they can overfit to the specific patient you're looking at.
Overfit.
Yeah. It's like creating a rule that only works for that one patient but doesn't really apply to anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not very helpful, right?
Yeah, not at all.
So stability is a way of making sure that the rules AdaWhips generates are more generalizable. It's finding the balance between being very specific and being broadly applicable. And then finally, AdaWhips can also generate what are called counterfactuals.
Counterfactuals, what are those?
They're like what-if scenarios. They show how the confidence in the diagnosis would change if you slightly tweak the patient's data. For example, it might say that if the patient's blood pressure was just a little bit higher, the model might not be so sure about the diagnosis anymore.
Oh, I see. So it's not just giving you the diagnosis and the reasons why, but it's also letting you explore the boundaries of that diagnosis.
Yeah.
So you can see which factors are really driving the decision. It gives you a much more nuanced understanding of what the model's doing. And the paper actually gives some really interesting examples of how AdaWhips works in real-life medical scenarios.
It does, yeah.
Want to walk through a few of those?
Sure.
Okay, so the first example is about detecting fetal heart abnormalities. What kind of rule did AdaWhips come up with there?
Well, in that case, AdaWhips looked at data from fetal heart rate monitoring, and it generated a rule for classifying a fetus as normal. And this rule was based on three factors. The first was DP, which is the number of prolonged decelerations per second in the fetal heart rate.
Okay, DP.
And the rule said that DP had to be less than or equal to 0.0013. The second factor was ALTV, which is the percentage of time with abnormal short-term variability in the heart rate. And for normal, ALTV had to be less than or equal to 7.7. And finally, there was MIN, which is the minimum value of the baseline fetal heart rate histogram. And that had to be less than or equal to under 13.15. So basically, the rule said that if all three of these conditions were met, the fetal heart rate was considered normal.
Okay, so it's looking at these three very specific measurements from the fetal heart rate data. And if they all fall within certain ranges, then it's classified as normal. What was the confidence level for this rule? How often was it correct?
Well, this rule is pretty accurate. It had a confidence level of 98.2%, meaning that when those three conditions were met, the model was almost always right about the fetal heart rate being normal. And the coverage, which is how often this rule applied to cases classified as normal, that was 60%. So it applied to a pretty good chunk of those cases.
That's pretty impressive. And what about the contrast information? You know, those what-if scenarios we were talking about.
Right. So the contrast information showed how much the precision of the rule would drop if you changed one of those conditions. For example, if the DP value, that number of prolonged decelerations, went above 0.00013, the precision of the rule would go down by 74.5%.
So that one factor, the DP, it seems to be really important in determining whether the fetal heart rate is considered normal.
Yeah, it does.
All right, so that's fetal heart abnormalities. The paper also had an example about mental health assessment, right? What was that rule about?
Right. In that example, AdaWhips generated a rule for identifying people who had sought treatment for mental health issues in the past. And that rule was based on two conditions: work interfere, which measures how much a person's mental health problems affect their work or daily life, and family history, which tells you whether the person has a family history of mental illness.
Okay.
So the rule said that work interfere had to be less than or equal to 1.5, and family history had to be greater than 0.9. And that rule had a confidence level of 94.6% and a coverage of 24.9%.
Interesting. So it's saying that if your mental health issues aren't interfering too much with your work and you have a family history of mental illness, you're more likely to have sought treatment in the past.
That's how the model sees it, yeah. And the contrast information showed that both of those conditions were important, but work interfere seemed to be a little bit more important than family history.
And there was another example about hospital readmissions, right? Predicting who was at low risk of being readmitted within 30 days.
Right. That one was interesting. It's focused on how often patients had used healthcare services in the past. The rule for low risk was based on four factors: #inpatient, which is the number of previous inpatient visits; #emergency, which is the number of emergency room visits, hashtag outpatient, which is the number of outpatient visits, and hashtag diagnoses, which is the total number of different diagnoses the patient had. And for a low-risk classification, all of those numbers had to be below certain thresholds.
Okay, so if you haven't been going to the hospital or the doctor's office a lot lately, and you don't have a ton of different health problems, the model thinks you're less likely to end up back in the hospital soon.
Yeah, basically. And that rule was really accurate, too. It had a confidence of 98.1%. The coverage was a bit lower, though, only 16.5%. But the contrast information showed that all 4 of those factors were really important.
And the final example was about thyroid conditions. What was that rule?
That one was really straightforward. It just looked at one thing, the TSH level. That's a blood test that measures thyroid function. And the rule simply said that if the TSH level was above 6.83, then the thyroid was considered abnormal.
Just one factor? That's interesting. And how did it perform?
It was very accurate when it applied, with a confidence level of 98.2%. But the coverage was pretty low, only 8.2%. So it seems like there are probably other factors that the model is using to diagnose thyroid problems in the rest of the cases.
Okay, so AdaWHIPS is clearly good at taking these complex AdaBoost models and breaking them down into understandable rules.
Yeah.
But how does it compare to other methods that are out there for explaining black box models? Are there other tools that can do this too?
Yeah, there are. And the researchers actually compared AdaWHIPS to 2 other popular methods called anchors and lore. These methods are model-agnostic, meaning they can be used to explain any black box model, not just AdaBoost.
Okay, model-agnostic, so they're more general purpose.
Exactly. So they tested all 3 methods on 9 different medical data sets and looked at 3 main things. Coverage, which is how broadly applicable the explanations are, precision, which is how accurate the explanations are, and stability, which is how resistant the explanations are to overfitting.
So how did AdaWHIPS stack up against the competition?
Well, in terms of coverage, AdaWHIPS did really well. It was either better than or the same as the other 2 methods.
Okay, so its explanations are more generalizable. They apply to more cases.
Right. And for precision, AdaWHIPS was also very competitive. It was basically just as accurate as anchors and lore. But where AdaWHIPS really shined was stability.
Stability, that's avoiding those overly specific rules, right?
Right. AdaWHIPS was much less likely to overfit than the other 2 methods. In some cases, anchors and lore came up with rules that only worked for a single patient. But AdaWHIPS was much more consistent in generating rules that applied to a broader range of cases.
So it's more reliable in a sense?
Yes, exactly.
You can trust its explanations more because they're not just flukes. And what about the speed? How fast can AdaWHIPS generate these explanations? Because in a clinical setting, doctors don't have all day to wait around.
That's the good point. And AdaWHIPS was actually pretty fast. It was about as fast as anchors and much faster than lore, especially when dealing with large data sets.
That's great. So it's not just accurate and reliable, it's also practical to use in a real-world medical setting. And there was one other thing the paper mentioned about AdaWHIPS that I thought was interesting. It doesn't require discretization. What does that mean?
Yeah, so some of those model-agnostic methods like anchors and lore, they need you to turn continuous data into discrete categories before you can use them. Like if you have blood pressure readings, you might have to divide them into groups like high, medium, and low before you can feed them into the model. But AdaWHIPS doesn't need that extra step. It can work directly with the continuous data, which can be more accurate and preserve more information.
Okay, so it's a more streamlined process. You don't lose any detail by having to categorize the data beforehand.
Exactly.
So all in all, it sounds like AdaWHIPS is a pretty impressive tool for making AdaBoost more transparent and understandable.
I would agree with that. I think it's a big step forward.
What are the main takeaways for doctors?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that AdaWHIPS gives doctors simple, easy-to-understand explanations for why AdaBoost is making certain diagnoses. They don't have to just blindly trust a black box anymore.
Right. They can actually understand the reasoning behind it.
Exactly. And they can use that information to make more informed decisions about their patient's care.
Now, the paper did mention that AdaWHIPS is model-specific, so it only works with AdaBoost, right? What about other black box models that are being used in healthcare? Is there anything out there for those?
Well, that's the advantage of those model-agnostic methods like anchors and lore.
Yeah, they're more flexible.
Right. But in a lot of cases, especially when you're developing a CAD system, you know exactly what model you're using and you have all the data. So in those situations, a model-specific method like AdaWHIPS can actually be more accurate and give you more useful information.
Makes sense. So where do you think this research is going next? What's the future of AdaWhips and explainable AI in medicine?
Well, I think one of the biggest areas is going to be extending AdaWhips to work with other types of ensemble models.
Like those gradient boosting machines you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And also applying it to more and more different healthcare problems.
And the more we can understand these black box models, the more we can trust them and use them to improve patient care.
That's the goal.
It's really fascinating to see how AI is being used in medicine.
It is, yeah.
And it's even more important to make sure that AI is used responsibly and ethically. And explainability is a huge part of that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just the beginning. As AI gets more and more sophisticated, it's going to be crucial to develop methods like AdaWhips that can help us understand how these models are thinking. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with a bunch of black boxes making decisions that we don't understand. And that's not a future that anyone wants.
Definitely not. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into explainable AI and AdaWhips. We hope this is giving you a better understanding of how this exciting new technology is being used to improve healthcare.
It was my pleasure.
And be sure to tune in next time for another deep dive into the world of complex systems that need clear explanations. Until then, stay curious.